Oh, hey everyone. Good morning. Good morning. I'm here. I'm back. And boy, do we have a fun one today. I got my Book of Mormon. I got my Bible. And yeah, we're prepared for something great. Because you know when I whip this thing out, I'm in the mood for something. Um, it relates. It definitely relates to what we're talking about today. So don't worry. I know I shoehorn my own idiosyncrasies with Mormonism in here and stuff like that, but I promise you guys, it's a real connection today, and because of that real connection, let's look at our Bible passage, shall we? All right, let's do this. Um, so today we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 1, and this is pretty important because this is where we are going to um, be kind of spending our time. We're just going to look at these first 4 verses here. This is from Luke 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So this is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, right at the beginning. And Luke is one of the Gospels that sets out to tell us that we're being presented with an account. And the account that we're being presented with is one that is kind of been historically and scientifically in the sense of today, right? This idea that we can pull together sources has been sourced through us, right? He's going back to people who were there, who've seen it, and he's trying to tell Theophilus, which could be a person, but it also could just be a name for any believer, because in Greek it literally means lover of God. So it could be, which was a name, but we know there were plenty of people that had that name, but also it could just be the name, kind of like a stand-in for whoever loves God, right? So in this passage, the reason I bring this up is because Luke wants to root what he's doing in history. Now, of course, interestingly enough, we aren't told that Luke, we aren't told that outside of the Gospel of John, that any of the writers of the Gospels is the name that's attached. These are names that kind of come later. I don't think that they're by church tradition. I don't think they're necessarily wrong. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that Luke kind of never identifies himself as Luke. The only time we kind of get close is in Acts when he says we. Sometimes he'll use that in we because he also wrote Acts. So that's why scholars or some people think that it's Luke. John always talks about himself as the beloved disciple. So we know that that's John. But in Matthew and Mark, we never actually have reference to who wrote those. Those are from tradition solely. The only reason I bring this up is because all of the Gospels claim to be eyewitness accounts, and I think it's important that Luke makes it clear, right? I think they're all trustworthy, but Luke wants to go out of his way because he's writing for a Gentile audience mostly. This is what I've seen, this is what other people have seen, this is my report to you, right? So this is like a first-hand eyewitness account, and I think all the Gospels are actually eyewitness accounts, but that's besides the point. So here Luke is saying, this is what I have seen, and I think this is really important because as Christians we will run into the idea that, or maybe like they're and I don't want to just downplay this, but some people will say just if you have enough faith, blind, like, I don't want to say blind faith, but that's really what it ends up being, then that's enough. And of course, like, we don't need to have fully developed thoughts on every little thing that we do all the time, know every piece of theology, know to be able to cite any ancient and historical source at the drop of a hat. But we cannot be people of faith, blind faith only, right? We have to have this kind of bedrock of ideas here, and some Christians will disparage that. Some will say, no, it's just faith, you don't need to have any sort of rationalism or intellectualism. But here, right, we see Luke very clearly state that that's an important thing, right? Especially when it comes to believing and actually having a grounding for your faith. Now, sometimes that grounding can be personal experience and things like that, and I don't want to say that that's necessarily wrong, but that shouldn't be our only ground for faith, right? We should be able to have an understanding of why we believe what we believe, rather than just, because our parents told us or because we saw something. Not that that doesn't mean it doesn't matter, but we need to be able to give an account of ourselves, like Luke is here, and present people with an alternative, an understanding of like, how do you make this clear for people? So I want to talk about that, because some of these things that we talk about today are going to be not be able to be decided by faith, but through rationality and thought, and being able to think for ourselves and being able to judge what is more likely. So the reason I bring this up is because over these past few weeks I've been reading this book, and this is like I can't find like a bigger. Wikipedia always has these tiny, terrible versions of the things. I'm sure they're copyrighted, so they can't like put a full version. They have to put like a tiny one on their site, but I digress. I've been reading this book by John Krakauer called Under the Banner of Heaven, A Story of Violent Faith. And it's a book about these two fundamentalist Mormon guys who believe that they're prophets, and believe that they have that they're supposedly this one figure that was prophesied to come, someone who was one mighty and strong, and so they end up thinking that they're the prophets. And it turns out, well, obviously I don't believe that they're prophets, but they end up murdering a woman and her 15-month-old child in a pretty brutal fashion, and this is kind of what John Krakauer, who's a journalist, he wrote two other books that I've read. One very famous called Into the Wild, which just turned into a movie, and then another one called Into Thin Air, which was about the Everest disaster, which he just happened to be at, which is really, really interesting. So both of those have like more of a nature focus. This is his the only book I've read by him that has kind of a more religion focus, while also kind of being like a true crime story. It was okay. Really, what kind of ended up annoying me about the book is what we're going to get into. But overall, like, it was enjoyable enough, at least for me to remember it and talk about it on this. I just finished reading it. And then, of course, part of what made me want to read the book, is because this series came out last year called Under the Banner of Heaven, and it's a series starring Andrew Garfield, and it's a dramatic kind of retelling of the book's narrative, and it's good. I liked it actually more than the book, I think. And obviously, like, it has different problems, but that's separate. But both of these things follow the structure that John Krakauer did, where he tells the story of this murder, and he, at the same time, tells a parallel narrative about Mormonism and its foundation and its history. So you kind of have two. That's why it's called The Story of a Violent Faith, because Krakauer, I think a little reductively, kind of says that Mormonism has in its roots violence, and that, like, we shouldn't be surprised when this sort of stuff happens. And I'm not necessarily against that, but sometimes the way he says it makes it seem like any Mormon at any time is going to just break out and kill someone, which is not the case, right? That hasn't been my experience with them, and I've had quite a few experiences with Mormons in my life. But I do think that his thesis that there's violence kind of at the center is certainly there, especially when you look at the history and the things that happen. So I read the book, I watched the series, and I said, well, I should do something about this, because we should talk about the implications of what is true and how can we tell that. And I think what made me really want to talk about this, it also, just as a side note, gives me a great excuse to use a thumbnail with my face on Joseph Smith's body. So I'm really excited for that. Or maybe one with me. I mean, this might be a little blasphemous, but I think because it's fake, I don't think anyone will be mad at me. But there's a famous picture that's in the Book of Mormon where Jesus is preaching to the Native Americans, and maybe I'll put my face on Jesus's body because it's not really Jesus, right? Whatever. Maybe I'll do one or the other. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. But it's going to give me a good thumbnail opportunity. Regardless, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because Krakauer says several times something to this effect. And I think this is largely due to the fact that it's written in 2003. And I can kind of give the idea for why I think that that's an important distinction for when this was written. But this is a claim that we hear all the time as Christians. And I think that we need to really be able to say this isn't true. And I think we need to be able to tell people why. And this is why, like, faith alone as a way of convincing or saying that you understand what is right isn't helpful, especially for people on the outside of the faith. So this is a quote from the book, and this is one of the ones that stuck out to me. I remember when I read this, and I rolled my eyes. So he's talking about like the history of the Book of Mormon, and he talks about how it was received at the time it was written. And I think right before this, he talks about the Mark Twain quote. So Mark Twain, American writer, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer. He got a copy of the Book of Mormon because he's actually he's a little bit after it, but he's pretty contemporary with what's going on. And he refers to the Book of Mormon as chloroform in book form. And chloroform is the stuff in movies, where they put something on the rag and put it over someone's face and they pass out, right? It was something that's used to put you to sleep. And so he said it was chloroform in book form, which I don't necessarily disagree with. It is not a very exciting read. But of course, that's a subjective experience, right? I'm sure people would say the Bible's boring to read, and of course we tell jokes all the time about Leviticus and Deuteronomy and stuff like that, or at least I did, Numbers, books like that. But anyway, so he says, this is Krakauer writing, he says, such criticism and mockery are largely beside the point. All religious belief is a function of non-rational faith, and faith by its very definition tends to be impervious to whoever recorded this quote on Goodreads messed up, but impervious to intellectual argument or academic criticism. Polls routinely indicate, moreover, that 9 out of 10 Americans believe in God. Most of us subscribe to one brand of religion or another. Those who would assail the Book of Mormon should bear in mind that its veracity is no more dubious than the veracity of the Bible, say, or the Quran, or the sacred texts of most other religions. The latter texts simply enjoy the considerable advantage of having made their public debut in the shadowy recesses of the ancient past, and are thus much harder to refute. And when I read that, I rolled my eyes, and I also thought, like, well, you haven't spent a lot of time with biblical academics because they're always trying to refute the Bible. And they think they're pretty successful at it. So, it's not like that doesn't happen at all. And I would say that this is where it's a very good example, right? Because he says that all religious belief is a function of non-rational faith. And I think that that's a pretty big misunderstanding of what we as Christians believe, and what I think most religious people believe, or I would say most people of good conscience try and believe, is that it's not just faith that is our bedrock, right? That's maybe what starts us off, and maybe that's where we end, but there's a pretty big middle point where we would like to prop up what we believe with actual facts that we can find, right? And I think, like, for all their faults, even though I disagree with them, I mean, this is something that young Earth creationists will point out all the time, right? That a lot of people just accept the scientific narrative on faith because they trust the scientists, right? Now, of course, there's a bedrock to that evolutionary belief or whatever, but, like, for a lot of people, they don't do the research into these things, and so for them, it really is faith, right? They just trust what their teachers say and what the scientists say, and so they don't do it for ourselves. And I think most of us are like that, right? I don't know how my computer works in every single way, right? But I trust that whoever makes it could explain it to me, and I would just take that at face value because they're an expert or whatever. But of course, when religion comes into it, religion is one of those things that is really annoying for me, because in basically every other aspect of life, people are willing to trust experts to tell them what things believe. But when it comes to faith or religion, right, everyone's opinion is equal. And that can be good and it can be bad. But here's a good example, right? So he says the Book of Mormon is no more dubious than the veracity of the Bible or the Quran or sacred texts of other religions. And I have a pretty big problem with that, because I think that we as rational people can look at claims, right? God has gifted us the ability to discern what is right and wrong. And we can look at two competing claims about something, and we can say, well, only one of these is true. So, for instance, the Bible and the Quran, right? He brings up the Quran there, a book of the Islamic faith. The Quran says that Jesus wasn't crucified. The Bible says he was. Now, only one of those two things can be true, right? So only one of them, veracity is truth, right? It has to do with being true. So only one of them can have that truth. How do we determine which one it is? Well, we can't just say, oh, they're both equally true, because that isn't possible, right? If we're just thinking about this logically. What would we use to determine that? Well, we would look at scientific, we can't really look at scientific. We'd look at historical and literary data, and we would make a call, right? Now, we might have to say, well, it's 90 whatever % likely, but there might be a chance that it's not. But, most people, secular and non-religious and religious scholars would say that Jesus was crucified. It seems pretty clear from the historical record and from the biblical record and from certain types of tests that we usually use in historical studies to say it's pretty almost 100% certain that Jesus was crucified. And in order to get around this, if you watch debates with Muslims and Christians and stuff, Muslim apologists will usually say that Jesus was actually swapped with someone on the cross. So someone was crucified. Everyone thought it was Jesus, but it wasn't actually him, right? Now that's a faith claim. Again, you might be able to root that in truth, but that seems to be something that's a little bit more out there. So when Krakauer says this, and he says something to this effect multiple times throughout the book, and it drives me bonkers when he does this. And I think it's because it's 2003. If you remember, this is post 9/11. In these early years of the 2000s, for anyone who lived in them and through them, you might remember how anti-religious this period was. This is the period where we get new atheism. So Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, the other guy who I can't remember, Sam Harris. Those guys become huge in this time period, and it's a pushback against what happened at 9/11, right? Because that was a religious terrorism, right? It was Muslim extremists who ran the planes into the towers and into the Pentagon. And so that caused a lot of people, right? We're living in a scientific, quote, age, right? To look at these things and say, well, this is all nonsense. And it's all equally nonsense, right? And now Krakauer, I think, would be more on the center where he would say, well, yeah, we can't prove any of this stuff is true, but clearly it's really important to people, but we shouldn't pretend that any one religion is more ridiculous or less ridiculous than other ones, right? And I appreciate that he's not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but I never found that argument very helpful, because there are certain claims that some religions make that we can say are less likely than other competing claims, right? And I think all of us, now I will say that to Krakauer's point, all of us have these types of things, right? But I think the strength of belief and strength of faith when there's less things that you have to take on faith compared to more things. So to give you an example, the entirety of the New Testament is rooted in history, right? We don't have to take on faith that Paul kind of has this view of Jesus Christ, right? Because it's his writings. We don't have to just trust someone that said, oh yeah, I talked to Paul and Paul had this, right? No, it's Paul is himself saying that, and then that's corroborated in what is told to us in Luke. So we kind of have two historical sources, primary and a secondary source, right? And I mean, Luke is a primary source, but in a different way. We have it coming from Paul, and then we have it coming from someone who witnessed Paul. Now, one of these things that as Christians, I would say that the center of our faith is an event that we can trust eyewitnesses in, but is ultimately one of faith, and that's the resurrection, right? And I think that's basically the only one that Christianity has, is it all rests on Jesus Christ's resurrection. That's where Paul says, right? And that's why he says it's, this is like, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, we believe in vain, right? That is like the center. All the other stuff is peripheral. But what matters is that, right? But one of my problems with Mormonism, and with some other religions as well, although not all, like Buddhism doesn't really have this problem, for example, is that there's tons of stuff you have to take on faith in the Book of Mormon. And one of the things that I want to point out is this is from First Nephi. So First Nephi is the first book of the Book of Mormon, and you'll see that supposedly this was written around 600 BC, and also that this is written by a guy named Nephi, and that he is going to be kind of this is a record of his people, and tells a story about how Jews sailed from Holy Land and they go all the way to America and the stuff that happens in there, right? And I think already you can kind of see the differences here, right? This isn't like the Jews going to Babylon or something. This is a pretty insane thing to think is possible from a rational point of view. And so when Krakauer says the veracity of the Book of Mormon and the veracity of the Bible are the same, or can be the same, it's like, no, they're not. like I'm not saying that the Bible is perfect. Like I do believe, it's perfect, infallible and stuff, but I'm not saying like you can't really question some of the things, the claims the Bible makes, but like it's definitely in a totally different realm than the Book of Mormon. And so one of the things that he starts out here, though, right, is that he is going to claim, this is Nephi, but it's Joseph Smith, I believe, claim that this is a thing that he is testifying to, and we can trust it, right? So he says, this is the first verse of the Book of Mormon. I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, therefore, I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my father, and having seen many affections in the course of my days, nevertheless, having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days, yea, having had a great knowledge of the goodness and the mysteries of God, therefore I make a record of my proceedings in my days. So he's telling us, right, the reader, that he is going to make a record for us. So this is something that is a first-hand account or a second-hand account of things that happened in the past. And then he goes on, right? He says, yea, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. And I know that the record which I make is true, and I make it with mine own hand, and I make it according to my knowledge. And so this is supposedly written by Nephi, and he's writing this in the Egyptian language, which is becomes a kind of a problem. But again, all of these things are they're making the same claim, right? Nephi is making the same claim as Luke. Who are we going to believe? Because if you look at the two, I mean, the Mormons say they have the Bible, but if you've ever interacted with them and stuff, you realize that they don't really read the Bible. They really just read the Book of Mormon and other things. And so like what Jesus says and does in Luke and what the beliefs of Luke and Paul are very different than the presentation that we get in the Book of Mormon. And so if we are to believe what Krakauer says, I think pretty irrationally, that both of these things are the same, then we can test both of these things. And one of the things that I found helpful about the book Under the Banner of Heaven is it goes through the ways that the Book of Mormon has some serious problems, right? Like the fact that there are really there's no record and genetically, linguistically, anything like that anyone in the New World is related to Jews, right? The Native Americans who Mormons called Lamanites or call Lamanites. Lamanites are the basically what happens is the Jews come over and the guy has two sons. One of them is Laman, and Laman and his descendants are kind of the bad guys in the Book of Mormon, and they continually attack the good guys. And eventually, at the end, they wipe out all the followers of Jesus in the New World, and they're cursed to have red skin. And so they turn into the Native Americans, and they lose all knowledge of what they've done over the centuries or whatever. And so that's why when the Europeans show up, there's no Christianity or no whatever going on. And so that's the story, right? And if we're to believe that, then we have to be able to see evidence that these things, there's some sort of record. And we don't have that. And so that right there is something that we have to take on faith. Now, I'm sure there are Mormon apologists who will try and claim that like Mayan cities or something are that, but there's no reference or there's no easy connection, right? We actually have references to Jews in the ancient world, so we know where they are. We know that they were in Canaan, right? We have references to them. And so we don't have anything even close to that in the New World. And so I think my whole point here is just to say that we as Christians, like, this is a common belief. What Krakauer says is a really common belief that we're going to run into. And we need to be able to say and have a grounding in our faith to say, this is what is true, this is what is not. We respect other religions, absolutely, but we don't have to pretend like all of them are equally valid, because not all religions are equally valid. Like I've talked before on a theologue about a guy who said that he was taken up by aliens, right? And that's like that's like a founder of this new religion. And I don't think that we have to say that that's just as likely as the claims that the Bible makes, because one is kind of falsifiable in some way, right? Like we can look at historical records and make a call either one way or another. With that one, we just have to take one guy's word on it. So I get it. I get why people say these things, but it annoys me so very much. So anyway, I'd still recommend reading the book. It's pretty good, especially if you don't know anything about Mormonism. And just, with that grain of salt, you'll run into that. And I mean, it's good food for thought. Clearly, I've spent 26 minutes talking about it, so I guess joke's on me, right? Anyway, hope you guys have a good rest of your day. And I will see you guys on Sunday for worship. And peace out.